of this piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr Heatley. You'll be hearing a lot more from me in part 4 of this piece of legislation, which is yet another day in the sad history of Phil Heatley, Minister of Housing. But we'll get to that in part 4. Mr Chair, again, as other members have said, I'd like to thank the submitters who came along to the Select Committee on the infrastructure bill and the officials who worked on it. It's interesting, though, you put up a piece of legislation in the House that has the word infrastructure in the title, and National MPs think they've now solved all infrastructure problems, kind of, if you pass it, it will come. And the reality is that while this is a good piece of legislation, it was a piece of legislation drafted by the former Labour government, this bill will not solve all infrastructure problems. This bill does not change the fact that the government's focus and priorities in infrastructure are skewed. They do not represent the needs, particularly in rail. And where I come from, the government's looking at closing the Gisborne to Napier rail line. This is a rail line that we fought to keep open for a long time. It was only under the previous Labour government that became a reality, and now the National Government wants to try and get rid of it as well. Well, they want to turn it into a cycleway, of course, which is their answer to everything. If you're in doubt, build a cycleway. The reality is that rail will always be part of the long-term mix of transport in Gisborne. It could be used an awful lot more than it's currently being used, and I hope that the government will see sense on that. Because, of course, part 1 of this bill implements a code. And the interesting thing about the code was when we were at Select Committee and they were discussing the code and how important it was that there's buy-in and they'll go out and consult on it, they then told us that, in fact, the code had already been written. And was already there in a draft form. So the cart was kind of put before the horse in that respect. And what became clear at Select Committee was there was an expected and understandable, I suppose, tension between rail operators and road transport operators. And it seemed like national members on the Select Committee did not want to acknowledge that there was a difference between the road corridor and the rail corridor. And of course, when it comes to access to infrastructure such as power lines or gas and water infrastructure, you need to be able to get to it when there's a problem. But of course, the difference is that if in a road corridor it's easy to divert traffic, a rail corridor has to absolutely shut down when work is being done. And those who came along and submitted from the rail perspective wanted that to be understood. That it's all very well to just say everything should be treated the same, but the rail corridor is different and the disruption is far greater when you have to close down the entire line. And it seemed like national members didn't really want to acknowledge that, which was a shame. Well, they don't like rail, and I think that's kind of where we came to. And we kind of got a little bit of an insight, I think, as to why a number of infrastructure and lines companies were quite keen to turn rail lines into cycleways when it came out. And I often wondered why Eastern Infrastructure was so keen on turning our rail track into a cycleway until I started to read the submissions on the infrastructure legislation and realised that they'd probably find it far easier to access their lines if it was a cycleway than as a rail corridor. And I think that that's where that's coming from, which is a shame because well, that's right. Well. Well, we'd have to put out a special warning if Mr Mallard was on the corridor, on the cycleway.
You know that Mallard's an engine, don't you?
Did I? I did not know that the Mallard wasn't injured. That is extremely interesting. The other part I want to speak about in this, which is a very important part, which is when we're looking at the definitions, Labour members were very concerned about the definition around waste and wastewater infrastructure and who would be considered the utility operator. Now, the utility operator means, and this is definition of utility operator Part D, in relation to water and wastewater infrastructure, a local authority as defined in Section 5 of the Local Government Act 2002. And then what was added in by the national members of the Select Committee are these words, or any person acting on behalf of a local authority in relation to that infrastructure. And when this was flagged with the Select Committee, it was kind of raised as, well, this is just a small issue so we can have flexibility. Well, this is actually clearly an issue to preempt the future privatisation of these infrastructure services in wastewater and water. And we accepted that in Auckland, they've already gone part way, and we needed to make sure that the situation in Auckland was covered by this piece of legislation. So we suggested alternative wording that would have captured the situation in Auckland whilst not opening the door up holus bolus to privatisation of wastewater and water infrastructure. And that was turned down by the members of the National Government. And this clearly... Mr Chair.
Moana Mackie.
Thank you. And this clearly indicates to us, in relation of the debate that's going on around the Auckland super city issue, the intention of the national government for the future privatisation of these services. They want to make it as easy as possible to privatise these services, because there were ways of wording, and submitters came along and suggested wording, which, as I said, would have captured the situation in Auckland with the council-controlled authorities that are there already, but wouldn't have allowed the definition to open up as widely as it has. And we didn't really get any answers from members of National Party members of the Select Committee on this. Clearly they were just told what they needed to do, and that's how they voted. But it was an issue of significant concern for a number of submitters that came along, Mr Chair, and it seems like such a small thing, but the difference that those 10 or so words can make are enormous when it comes to our infrastructure services. Mr Chair, one of the interesting things about the code is also the exemptions and where it doesn't apply as much as it does apply. And this is one of the areas where I think we're going to have to be very, very careful and keep a close eye. It would have been far simpler for us to have designed a situation which would have ensured a total buy-in from all the parties, but in fact that's not what we got. And because I think that work hadn't been done at the very basic level, because I think they wanted to get this through, and the overarching intention was that this government's focus is purely on roads, so they're not really that fussed about all the other types of infrastructure that this bill deals with, we didn't get to that situation, and that is unfortunate. We were basically told, well, the code's already been drafted, despite the fact that the legislation says it's yet to be drafted and there's this whole process to go through in consultation. I mean, we're told categorically it's been drafted and lots of people don't agree with it, and there are significant sectors of the infrastructure sector that don't agree with it. And, well, yeah, who've dropped out, who've dropped out of being a part of it. And I think that really undermines the very basis of this code and the purpose of having it, because the purpose of having it was because we couldn't get agreement on when people could access the transport corridors. But when we're already in the situation that this piece of legislation is still in the House, hasn't even passed, and we already have parties that are dropping out, parties that don't want to be a party to this code, then I think that speaks to the process that this government has taken in getting the legislation to this point. And you can understand their frustration, Mr Chair, when we hear big words and big speeches about this fantastic process that has been set up, but then the Select Committee was told, well, it's already been drafted. The code's already there, basically take it or leave it, and we don't really see any point to going back and relitigating this with the sector. Well, Mr Chair, that actually runs contrary to Part 1 of this piece of legislation, and as I said before, it really does put the cart before the horse. And I'd be interested to know from the Minister and the Chair what work he is doing to try and make sure that all parties to this code, all parties that should be sign up to this code, are going to be brought on board, because it becomes somewhat redundant to have a code if all of a sudden people are dropping out all over the show and we end up in exactly the same situation that we ended up in before, which is that someone going in to do work on a transport corridor has absolutely no idea, in fact, where all the infrastructure is located, because that information isn't being supplied. Because the council plans are 2 or 3 metres out, so they dig somewhere where they think is safe and suddenly they hit a water main or they hit a... It's madness, says Mr Heatley. Well, he'd know. I'll take it from an expert. That's right. Phil Heatley certainly knows how to dig, so I'll take it from an expert in that regard. But it is. I think all members of this House acknowledge that we're in a position... We're in an untenable position with regard to access to these corridors, but is this the best way to have gone about it? And are we actually going to resolve anything when we have a situation where affected parties are basically being told, take it or leave it? They're being told, well, this is legislation which will implement a code, but by the way, the code's already been drafted by certain elements of that sector, and if you don't like it, then that's just tough. And the fact is that we've been in a position of saying take it or leave it before, and it hasn't worked. That's how we've ended up where we've ended up. And part of that has been the government's refusal to acknowledge that rail is different from roading, that the implications for carrying out work in the transport corridors that involve rail are different from those that are being carried out in the transport corridors for roading. It's far easier to do work on roading and leave a road open than it is to do work on rail and rail.